Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group. We're excited for this presentation as our founder, Tony Byrne, is going to walk us through some trends to expect here with your new MarTech stack in the year 2023. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and it's great to see so many of you take the time to join us today. This will be a 30-minute presentation and expect it to be rapid fire. So you're welcome to ask questions as we move along in the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel, as we will have some time for questions at the end. Also, the session is being recorded, so you will be able to access a copy of this recording if you're one of our subscribers. And then for everyone that attends today, you will be able to access the slides from today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to get us started today. Tony?
Hey, Scott, thanks. So I founded Real Story Group 22 years ago. I know about a little bit less than half of you have ever seen us before. So I want to just give you a little bit of background about who we are and why we're interested in this. So I founded the company when I was working at a systems integrator implementing content management and search solutions in the early 2000s. And we used to use traditional research from traditional analyst firms. And we found that, you know, what they said in their quadrants and their evaluations weren't reflecting the real story as we saw it as implementers, that there were a lot of devils in the technical details. And then we found out that nearly all analyst firms walk both sides of the street. In other words, they advise vendors on their roadmaps, then also advise customers on their technology selections. And we really thought that was fundamentally a conflict of interest. So we decided right away we would never advise vendors, never speak at their events, never let them pay us to issue press releases praising them and all sorts of things like that. We only work on your side of the table. That is the technology buyer who's looking to really make a good decision for their enterprise. And I love this topic of MarTech stack and strategy, and we'll I want to just walk you through. We're going to talk about 4 trends today. We're going to talk about Pilates. We're going to talk about MarTech. We're going to talk about journey orchestration, and then we're going to wrap up first with a discussion of content, and then some final advice. So some of these are themes clearly that carry over from 2022 and indeed maybe even 2021, but we think are really going to kind of reach ahead for many of you, if not already, then certainly as 2023 progresses. So if you know Real Story Group, you know that we cut our teeth, and still today a core part of our business is evaluating vendors in various MarTech marketplaces. So our evaluations are known for being comparatively rigorous and quite tough. And along the way, what started happening, it started 10 years ago, really started picking up 5 years ago, was people asking us, our clients and subscribers asking us to say, okay, how do these different pieces fit together? I see the subway map with all the different vendors and all the different choices, and some of them stop are on some major central stations here, but how do all the pieces fit together? And so this is kind of a vendor marketplace view of how all the pieces fit together, but it's not necessarily the view that you might need. And so we started in the 2010s sort of building reference models for how to do this, and so we'll start there. So this is kind of a reference model that we used in the 2010s, where we were starting to think about multi-channel. So you have these channels at the top, some production, interaction, delivery services in gray, and then these big colored boxes towards the bottom, you know, digital and media asset management, WCM, marketing automation, social engagement, so forth, and then ideally some sort of customer data backbone, but really that was more like customer data confusion for most of us at the bottom. And what most of you, and certainly we were doing this at the time, we're really focused on kind of modernizing these colored boxes here, really getting robust platforms in for things like marketing automation, WCM, building up internal capacity, internal teams, some cases replacing older first generation tools, developing strong vendor relationships. And so that was a reasonable sort of approach for that decade. But the problem was, as the decade was closing, was that we ended up creating all these different silos of content and data and processes. and our customers were struggling to have coherent experiences with us. And then all of that really got aggravated, of course, during the pandemic, right? When people were showing up in all kinds of different digital places, and we weren't necessarily able to engage with them in a coherent omni-channel way. And so we thought that this really begged a different reference model. And so this is a reference model that we came up with really for the 2020s. And many of you have seen this before. I won't linger too long here, but you still have engagement channels, interaction delivery environments, and then engagement services, which now can span quite a width of capabilities. But the key thing that we're getting at here are these enterprise foundation services. So these are capabilities across content and information on the bottom left, data in the bottom middle, and then decisioning services in the bottom right. And our core contention is that the challenge of this decade is to turn those into enterprise services that can then sit behind any of your burgeoning engagement capabilities, any new and emerging engagement channels, that to the extent that you've got an enterprise handle on what your core omni-channel content, your core customer data, the decisions that you want to make across different customer touch points, that you had to invest in these enterprise foundation services. So we sort of called this, the Pilates approach, where you were building up your core rather than like, building up these bulging chest muscles and shoulder muscles and, neck muscles and whatnot. That, okay, that's all well and good, but without a strong core, you're not actually going to be a powerful operation. So we, really kind of called this Pilates for the enterprise. And the interesting thing about it was this was both kind of descriptive and prescriptive. In other words, we were, when we came up with this 3 years ago, kind of describing a world that was coming into being. But one of the things that we've really seen, just even in the last half year, and I think it's going to really be more prominent in 2023, is enterprises being a lot more intentional about this. And, this can be a difficult case to make because the ROI on some of these is not always immediate. Like, what's the ROI on, investing in customer data operations, in digital asset management? It can be difficult to know what that is. And there's a lot of temptation to just get a better outbound marketing platform or invest more in social media engagement. And of course, those remain important customer-facing channels, but you're weakening yourself to the extent that you have a mismatch between what you can do foundationally and then what you're actually, showing the customer. And one of the things that we think for 2023 is organizations being more strategic about it and being more deliberate. In other words, saying, yes, I'm going to upgrade our loyalty platform, but along the way, I'm also going to upgrade our experience optimization and our omni-channel personalization across channels. In other words, balance out with the business and sometimes with the CFO and be much more declarative about, hey, if we're serious about omni-channel, if we're serious about future flexibility and plugging in different engagement channels, then we have to have these enterprise foundation services. So rather than kind of sneaking these investments, underneath the hood, making it really part of your MarTech investment portfolio and being very deliberate about it. And we're seeing a lot more MarTech leaders having the confidence to do that and being able to tell a really good story around that. Sometimes we help them tell that story, but really there's a way to take the use cases that come out of marketing and CX and then sort of convert those into, okay, these are core capabilities that we need. So we see this, being not so much something that's happening bit by bit, sort of accidentally, but something that MarTech leaders are really prescribing for their enterprises. The other thing that we're seeing too is that there is, with respect to our reference model, some slight difference between B2B and B2C. You would expect as much. There's a lot of still overlap at that foundation service layer. So that's really interesting, that you still need some of the same core capabilities underneath the engagement services. And so I think this is potentially promising for organizations that have B2B and B2C models or B2B2C models, that so long as they can support business entities from a data standpoint, that the foundation services underneath could be able to stretch for both if you get the right vendor. So that's really lesson one. Pilates as a strategy rather than as a tactic. The second trend is what we call MarTech. I don't know, it doesn't roll off the lips quite as neatly as MarTech, but it's real. Data is the third leg of this stool, and we've all been trying to get more serious about it. I think that we tend to think of it as something that happens at a lower level and maybe somebody else's responsibility, and I really think it needs to be a first-class player in the MarTech world, and we really do not need to start thinking about MarDayTech. And a lot of people have, including to some extent ourselves, have come at this sort of a little bit backwards, starting with we need a CDP, which is really kind of a little bit more on the front end of this, as opposed to what do we need to do from a customer data standpoint to really get where we want to go. So, I mean, this is really where, again, if you're thinking about this as enterprise foundation capabilities, this is where marketing ops and IT ops and data ops really meet. And so, you know, you can't just, much the same way that marketing realized in the 2010s, we can't just toss this over the wall to IT. We need to engage with IT, maybe even bring some IT into marketing and call it MarTech. And now we're having the same realization with data. We can't just sort of throw it on the wall, say there's other data people, they'll provide data products, we don't need to worry about it, or we're not going to be happy, you know, whatever. The data has to be integral to everything that you're doing, and you probably are going to need to bring more data capabilities into your marketing operation than you have now. Specifically, I think we're seeing the growth of what we call a customer data hub, which is a place where you have the full 360 unified view of the customer, where you're handling a lot of compliance and other complicated consent management, other complicated data operations. And this typically is going to serve multiple downstream constituents, not just marketing, right? Finance needs this, operations needs this, customer care, enterprise data, analytics, and yes, customer data activation in marketing and DX and CX. And so whether this is in scope for your CDP or not, this is a kind of a logical hub that you really do need, and maybe you layer a CDP on top of this. Maybe your CDP handles this capability. There's definitely a bifurcation in the CDP marketplace, but really thinking about this customer data hub. And if you don't have this or you can't build this and you layer a lightweight CDP on top of it, it's just gonna show how messy your data is. It's not gonna fix the problem. We also like this notion of kind of data products that can come out of this, and multiple different types of data products that then serve multiple different masters. So this is something that marketing may need to push for, but that, you know, the enterprise really needs as a whole. So the goal here is that you have this sort of blue area where you've got, you know, the customer data operations has been handled in some sort of customer data hub, and then it can feed customer data activation as well as enterprise analytics. One thing that we have been cautioning people about is not necessarily to build a customer data activation environment on top of an environment that was primed and delivered primarily for data analytics. These are two different derivative needs. They each have their own way of thinking about data, of modeling data, of labeling data. They definitely feed into each other. But we see a lot of pain points, and this is also one of the reasons why, by the way, we are somewhat skeptical about reverse ETL, because reverse ETL just has you going often very much directly from your analytics environment to an activation environment, and without anything in between, and very often this proves to be suboptimal for business people. So we can talk about that more a little bit later, but the bottom line here is, you know, you have to get your customer data house in order. We're really big believers in customer data hubs, customer data operations, and this notion of really bringing in data ops into your MarTech ops as a first-class, you know, participant in all this. I'll skip over this slide. I think hopefully it makes sense to you that there's a lot of different personas here. These often you need different personas here, whether these are part of your marketing team or your CX team, or whether it's part of enterprise data. That depends on the situation. I can say that more and more we're seeing enterprise data teams very much overwhelmed, driven by intense needs from legal, finance, executive reporting, product, all kinds of things. And very often marketing ends up on the low end of their queue. And they're not to blame for that. They're just under-resourced. And marketing historically maybe hasn't been so hungry. So what we're seeing in many successful organizations is sort of marketing picking up the lag and building up their own marketing data ops team within marketing, who then partner with and crosshatch across with the enterprise data team. I'll remind you again that that there's the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you have any questions, if you have any comments, something you agree with, disagree with, feel free to use that. And we're definitely gonna have time to get to that towards the end. Okay, so we looked at the reference model that says, look, there's some core data and decisioning and content things that are happening here. We looked at data, and now we're gonna look at decisioning. And decisioning is really, at some area, the most beguiling of this three-legged stool here, because nominally it should be the most exciting, but I think it's the area that we know, and I'll show you, has generated at some level the most frustration. And it's not like we haven't been doing this. I mean, if you look at personalization is kind of like the patient zero for all of the decisioning illnesses that we've been experiencing, but of course that isn't keeping people from experimenting and shouldn't keep people from experimenting. But I think it points to us what maybe some of the challenges are. So, first of all, where should personalization live? And then the question is, well, where is it living now in most enterprises? And the reality is, it's living almost everywhere. And this is one of the challenges we have, is that today you can find personalization subsystems in nearly every engagement environment and every engagement platform. So that's fine, as good as it goes, and some of them work even reasonably well. The problem is that, again, you can have a very chaotic and very difficult to report on and analyze environment here. So this is fine. I'm not telling you to turn off the personalization you may have in e-commerce or in your email marketing or what have you. It's good for test and learn. There's some degree of customer expectation around this. It doesn't require a major architectural overhaul, but in the long term, we really think this is going to have to become an enterprise service if you're going to be coherent about this, and if you're really going to measure this stuff effectively. And so then the question is, where do you seat this? How do I do this? How do I do this in omnichannel context? And unfortunately, I don't think that the marketplace itself has come up with a great answer yet. But in the meantime, of course, a lot of us are still struggling with personalization. Let's be honest with it. I mean, just even look at Amazon here. There's on the left, someone's searching toilet seats and then they get offered, well, why don't you get some AirPods Pro with that toilet seat? Well, okay, I guess so. Or this one on the left, where the guy is trying to surprise his wife with some flowers, and Whole Foods says, how about getting her a nice red bell pepper instead. These came from my colleague at Purv, and I really like them. But they suggested some of the people who are nominally the best at this are still missing, and in some cases it can be brand eroding rather than brand intensifying. And so a lot of the personalization wins that we see are really tactical, which is not a bad thing, right? If you can get 10% lift here, 12% lift there, great, go for it. But you really need to have some test and learn cycles and be methodical about it, as opposed to just having one pilot and then letting it die. In an ideal world, you would be making some of these decisions at an enterprise level, and then manifesting those decisions in across all of your different engagement services. No one is doing this successfully right now. We know some organizations that are slowly getting their way there. Nominally, this was what journey orchestration engines were supposed to do. So there was a journey orchestration engine marketplace that emerged really in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of independent players that claimed to be able to manage all of this, sort of like a nuclear power plant, everything that was happening between your customers and your systems, and what was the next best action or the next best offer. And what was fascinating to us is that market more or less collapsed in the past couple of years. There were all kinds of independent players here, most of which have disappeared, and been acquired by this lower right-hand box, CRM and CX oriented, which are very much around customer service and contact centers, and that's now you still see some major process-oriented vendors like Infor, Pega, to some extent Creatio. So the big heavyweight players are still out there. Then you have some vendors who have done some kind of suite-dependent journey orchestration engines. As you know, our take on these is you should be very suspect about those. But I think the marketplace collapsing was really telling us something, that maybe enterprises weren't quite ready for this. And it's really interesting. As you may know, Real Story Group has a MarTech Leadership Council that meets in person twice a year and offline a couple times a year. And the last one, we asked them to say, hey, how are you doing in these different areas? So green was, we're doing really well. Yellow was, we're doing okay. Red was, we're doing very poorly. And blue was, we are just not there. We're not thinking about it. We may be thinking about it, but not actually doing anything. So this is really interesting. First, look at some of the challenges in the orange box here: customer data activation, some reds there, a lot of reds under loyalty, which should surprise no one. But look over here on decisioning, a lot of blue, which I think suggests to me that whatever aspirations we have, we're not really, your peers are not yet sort of taking a stab at this. I think in part because we're still struggling with personalization and other forms of decisioning, just even within the individual silos, let alone being able to do it on an omni-channel basis. And also, quite frankly, we're not convinced that the tooling is there. By the way, it's almost the exact same story on the B2B side as well. So it's not like, you know, this is just something for B2C companies. So, you know, here's a picture of an old Soviet nuclear power plant, and this would be nominally the kind of controls we'd like to have. But, you know, the early journey orchestration engine adopters definitely got lost in the complexity. They didn't have the data. So you've got to have really good data or you can't do good decisioning. Always problems with connectors to front-end systems. Struggling with some of the ROI around their personalization efforts, and then lack of strategy and governance, which in turn very often led into a lack of content variance that you need for different sorts of experiences. So the Joe Marketplace collapsed. But what's interesting is that we see, and this is very much true among our leadership council, a lot of renewed interest in orchestration, right? So journey orchestration engines themselves, at least the independent players, may be dead, but there's a lot of interest in orchestration and in particular around omni-channel, and some of this has to do with cookie apocalypse, you know, the demise of third-party cookies, and at least wanting to align your media and your owned and operated interactions. But also aligning things like real-time e-commerce decisioning with outbound messaging. There's a lot of areas here where people are looking at least for a tactical alignment. Some CDP vendors are beginning to fill this gap with some lightweight journey orchestration capabilities, and so that can be really good. We think that can be really good training wheels for you in certain cases. The important thing really that we find is that this is one of those cases where probably it's a deficit in program capacity that's holding us back. So really the key is to build this internal program capacity around personalization, around decisioning, around next best action over time, and not necessarily kind of leap into the piazza all at once and declare that you're doing this, because your predecessors who have tried this have largely not been very successful, have tried to really take a big bang approach to this. Okay, that's decisioning. Now let's talk about content. And we've been riding this horse from a while, that the future, particularly around omni-channel, is really going from this notion of blobs of content to thinking about component content, and particularly thinking about assets. So assets, not just in the sense of digital assets that are binary files like videos and audio and images, but asset is, this is something we're saving. So this could be a chunk of text, it could be an offer, it could be some master data, something that you want to present as content in multiple different places, and it's important enough that you want to manage it not within a silo but at an enterprise layer, right? So we mean kind of assets in two different sense there. One of the interesting things, again going back to our MarTech Council, this is a year old but I think still apt, is that while they rated themselves pretty good at analytics and operations, they were doing okay on customer data and orchestration, omni-channel content was a real laggard. And I actually think omni-channel content is hard. Requires a lot of rethinking. Many of the platforms you're using today can't deal with it very well. And so this is, I think, one of the big blocker areas in a transition that many of you have yet to take. Perhaps the business case hasn't been there, fine, you know, but not to be overlooked in any omni-channel strategy. Let me put it that way. The answer we think around this is what we call an omni-channel content platform. These are not coming out of the web content management market. They're coming out of digital asset management or DAM market. Some of these are becoming more mature. They're complicated platforms. They tend to be more object-oriented, require a different way of thinking about content and data and assets. But the real holdback, really, we think, is more organizational and programmatic. In other words, if you're wanting to do this, this kind of model that we have here, it's probably not the technology that's going to get in your way. You can find omni-channel content platforms. You may need to license one, but what it gives you is this core set of reusable and trackable content asset product components. You can send them all through a translation management service and then feed them to your front-end systems. What's interesting about this, if you note at the top, is then the scope of your web content management system narrows. It's more about long-form experiential and value content and maybe some static page management, but the core content blocks that you're going to be reusing or deriving at some level are going to live in your OCP. And so I think this is the challenge really for 2023, is probably less about the technology and more about sort of reinventing the way that your content production pipeline works. All right, quick wrap up, and then again, any questions or comments that you have. So 4 key takeaways and a bonus. So continue to press for core enterprise, investments, even as you have to modernize your engagement platform. So we've been working with some of you to swap in a new email service provider, swap in a new web content management platform, to review your loyalty structure, to look at the social tooling that you're doing. Okay, so you do have needs to, and these can be high impact replacements and modernizations. But for every time you do that, we're going to suggest you also press internally for the same investment in core underlying platforms that can work underneath and across all of your engagement portfolio. 2023 is the year to really focus on data ops and marketing data ops, and assuming that you have dealt with some of the core underlying issues of, for example, identity resolution and compliance and consent management. Maybe you're still on that journey. Really feeding in data ops into your MarTech ops. And that may mean that you need to bring in some capabilities that you don't have yet because you can't get access to them from your enterprise data team. Invest incrementally in orchestration rather than do some big bang. Now, there's always caveats for this. We're working with one major global firm that is taking kind of a big bang approach to this, but that's because they've been doing this already tactically for 5 years. They've got a lot of takeaways. They know what they want to do. They're ready to make a major investment in this, and I think that they'll be successful with it. But for most of us, I would recommend investing incrementally in this area. Component content has been nirvana for many of us for 25 years. The business case for it has to be there. It is a business and operational and editorial challenge first and foremost, and not necessarily a heavy tech lift. Even though your existing platforms may not deal with this very well, there are platforms that you can license that are not crazy expensive that can help you get there. So your goal for 2023 is to really figure out what our component content strategy is and how can we execute on that. So the bonus key takeaways, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't add, you can always rely on Real Story Group for advice about stack and about individual vendors. And we find that those two overlap very much. We're looking at your stack, and a vendor will say they can do this, but really they don't do it very well. What are they really good at? Which of those colored boxes should you let them do, and which colored boxes shouldn't you let them do? So this whole conversation of what is the idealized stack for you off that generic reference model inevitably overlaps with what are the different vendors' key core strengths and weaknesses. So those two we find, playing together very well. So if you'd like to work with us, there's 3 different ways to do it. One is you can subscribe to an individual line on this tube map, license our research, for example, on the orange line, which is customer data platforms, and then we give you decision support tools to help you generate what we call real quadrants. In other words, what are the different vendors that fit your specific needs as opposed to some generic analyst diagram. The second option is to go full stack with us and license all of our research, and then we can also give you some advisory around issues relating to your stack and your stack health. And then some of those enterprises then are eligible to join our private members-only Stack Leadership Council. who are MarTech leaders, only from end user enterprises like you, no vendors, no consultants. We get together, we share. It's been a wonderful experience both for them and I'll say for us too. So if you have any questions about that, Scott can fill you in on next steps. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to use the GoToWebinar control panel.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, the council, we are open to hearing from you if that's something that would be interesting to you. We'll be meeting again virtually March 1st on the topic of personalization, and then again in person in early May in Chicago. So if that's something that you'd like to explore further, please reach out to us. You can always download samples from any of the research areas that we cover using the link below. And then if you're interested in some further webinars, we'll be having one at the same time next week, taking a look at one of those subway lines. We're going to look at 5 digital asset management trends to watch in 2023. So along the same line, we're looking at trends, but it's more specific to the dam space. See if any questions have come in on your side, Tony.
Yeah, I'm just seeing one from Alexis, and she's wondering, we didn't mention Microsoft very much here. This topic comes up a lot. Microsoft actually is on our subway map. They're really focused on building off of their CRM, their core CRM capabilities, and so that's where they have built some lightweight sort of business B2B oriented marketing automation platforms, and then kind of a lightweight CDP as well. But it's really the CRM is kind of the driver there. So it's a little bit different, for example, than some other strategies you might see sort of out of Adobe, Oracle, and others. Lee is asking, what is the typical technical architecture of customer data hub and associated operations? Is it a CDP or is it data warehouse or something else? That's a great question. So it could be a CDP because there are some CDP vendors that serve as infrastructure as opposed to as a marketing platform, or try to do both. More typically, we see it as a lakehouse and associated services around it. So a customer data hub can be a kind of virtualized environment that's producing, for example, different data products, one of which might be a stream of data to a CDP. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. We're trying to not define a particular physical architecture, but rather a logical architecture. And that's just, if anything else, to be empathic to all of the different models that we've seen out there and all the different legacy systems and what people can do with a Snowflake relative to other stuff. So Marcello is asking a question. Lots of journey orchestration companies claim they have a CDP, but is it reliable? I've seen this happen with some vendors. Yeah. So this is the thing, and Marcello, this is really one of the core issues, is that if you have not really built a solid customer data store of some kind, it's very difficult to do journey orchestration. So some people will have it backwards. They license a journey orchestration engine, and then the journey orchestration vendor says, where's your authentic, authorized, unified, high quality customer data? And the customer goes, well, I don't really have that. And so journey orchestration engines will then build in quasi CDP subsystems into their platforms just to do that job, because the decisioning wants to be close to data, and it's got to be close to good data. And so typically we would say, don't trust those, right? Like you should have an independent customer data hub plus a CDP, or a hub and, you know, however that works out based on the last question. Separately, distinct in your architecture from your decisioning services, and we would definitely encourage decoupling those two. Great, well, we've run a little bit over. Wanted to thank everyone for joining. I went a little bit short on the content, knowing that Jared was going to be talking a lot about the content side of the equation in his trends on content and digital asset management next week, so feel free to chime in on that. Thanks again for joining us here today. And for Scott, this is Tony Byrne signing off from Real Story Group. See you next time.